For that the people who first crossed the Rhine and expelled the Gauls and are now called Tungri were then named Germans, which appellation of a particular tribe, not of a whole people, gradually prevailed, so that the title of Germans, first assumed by the victors in order to excite terror, was afterwards adopted by the nation in general. Tacitus, circa 98 AD. Hi, my name's Mason, and this is the Sixth Age Medieval History podcast. What does it mean to be a barbarian? The word is an ancient Greek term. The Greeks were notoriously arrogant, and they believed themselves to be the epitome of civilization. While the Greeks didn't consider themselves to be a nation in the modern sense of the word, they did acknowledge that they shared a common cultural heritage with different cities who shared their language. Citizens of ancient Athens and ancient Sparta, though they would have recognized their shared cultural ties, weren't necessarily part of the same political unit. Members of different Greek societies did possess a certain degree of respect for each other because of that shared cultural heritage, but they did not extend that respect to people who did not speak the Greek language. So the rivalry between these Greek city-states kind of paled in comparison to kind of the hatred and disgust that the Greeks had for those who did not share their language. The few times that we see Greek city-states actually unite in a coalition, it's against a shared non-Greek speaking enemy. The Greeks called these non-Greek speaking peoples barbarians, those who can't speak Greek, because to the Greeks their languages sound a little bit like bar, 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 bar. As Greek colonists spread across the Mediterranean, the term barbarian took on kind of a new meaning to refer to anybody who was deemed insufficiently civilized. It's important to note that the Greeks measured civilization based on your relative Greekness. They would decide whether you were civilized based on whether they believed you were emulating Greek society. So societies that took on aspects of Greek culture and religion, like the Romans and Egyptians, weren't necessarily seen as barbarians, but those who didn't assimilate into Greek culture were viewed with disdain and scorn. The Romans adopted this language of barbarism to describe those who, unlike themselves, were free of Greek cultural, linguistic, and religious influence. Eventually, the word barbarian just came to mean those who lived outside of Roman rule. Basically, if you didn't submit to Roman authority and accept the, obvious benefits of Roman civilization, you were viewed as being uncivilized. The Romans dealt with a host of barbarians as they expanded their empire, and they dealt with them either by assimilating them into Roman culture or by annihilating them completely. In some provinces, the Romans used both tactics, assimilating barbarian tribes that allied themselves with the Romans early on, and destroying those that refused to submit to Roman authority. The Celtic peoples of Gaul, what is modern-day France, experienced both assimilation and annihilation at the hands of Julius Caesar, for example. The tribes that resisted Caesar's imposition of Roman authority were almost wholeheartedly wiped out, while those that accepted Caesar's overlordship would have children and grandchildren that would eventually become Roman senators under the Emperor Claudius. So let's fast forward to where we started the last podcast with the promulgation of the Antonine Constitution in 212 AD. Remember, this is the point where Roman citizenship is granted to all free men in the empire, thus making imperial provincials, partners in the universal Roman project. At this point, Rome has conquered a host of tribes, they've spread Roman religion, culture, and language among them. But this episode isn't necessarily about the people inside of the Roman borders, but about those just outside of them, whose incursions into Roman territory would destabilize and ultimately destroy the Western Roman state. So what I want to do here is a bit of a whirlwind tour of the barbarian groups that are right on the fringes of empire, and then we'll circle back to provide some more detail on each of them and how they contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire and the foundations of a lot of these new medieval states. So we'll start with the province at the very northwestern edge of the Roman world, Britannia, which is modern-day England and Wales. They were bordered by Pictish tribes in modern-day Scotland and Gaelic tribes in modern-day Ireland. The Picts would make overland raids into Roman Britain, while the Irish Gaels would conduct pirate raids on coastal Roman settlements. We have a few written accounts of pre-Christian Pictish and Gaelic societies, but as far as we can tell, these tribes shared a common Celtic ancestry with the British people that were living in Roman-controlled Britannia. On the European mainland, the Roman borders extended to the Rhine and the Danube rivers, with the exception of the Roman province of Dacia, which is modern-day Romania. It was on the other side of the Danube. It was the peoples on the other side of these Rhine and Danube frontiers that the Romans came to fear and hate after the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, in which a coalition of these tribes wiped out somewhere between 14,000 and 30,000 Roman soldiers. We do actually have some written accounts of these people, who we call Germans or the Germanic tribes, because the Roman ethnographer Tacitus spent some time among them and wrote about what he learned in his book, the Germania. While Tacitus viewed these people as being similar in language and religion, it's important to note that what we call the Germanic tribes were a host of tons of different people, each with their own cultural traditions. The empire on the east was bordered by the Sassanid Persians, who occupied modern-day Iran. The Sasanians were key Roman rivals for hundreds of years, and of all the peoples that bordered the Roman Empire, it was really the Sasanians who possessed kind of a Roman-style state. Like the Romans, the Sasanians were ruled by emperors. They had a state faith, which was Zoroastrianism. The Sasanians also had professional armies, imperial administrators, large cities, a lot of these hallmarks of what we consider to be classical civilization. The Romans therefore viewed the Sasanians as being kind of their main rivals, as it was really only the Sasanians who were able to field these large Roman-style armies, administer imperial rule across vast distances, and spread their culture and religion through imperial conquest. The Arabian Peninsula to the south of the Sasanian Empire was home to Arab tribes and kingdoms. They appear to have been semi-nomadic, with traders and herders traveling from cities to sell goods, horses, cattle. These tribes were key players in the Roman-Sasanian rivalry, as they were hired as mercenaries by both the Romans and the Sassanids. The other state that we're going to talk about is the Kingdom of Aksum, which is to the south of Roman Egypt, and occupied Sudan and Ethiopia. Aksum is another kind of Roman-style state. They practiced Christianity as the state religion, and the state was incredibly wealthy because they occupied a key trade route between the Roman world and the Indian Ocean. Traders would travel from Roman Egypt through the Arab Gulf to the Indian Ocean, and in doing so would pass a lot of these Aksumite ports. Roman North Africa was occupied by the Berber tribes, who lived within and outside of the Roman borders. Some of them operated as Roman clients. The Roman borders in North Africa weren't really a huge flashpoint for the Roman Empire in the way that a lot of these other borders were. Probably because, with the Sahara Desert right underneath Roman North Africa, there's not a large group of tribes to kind of contend with Roman rule. Okay, so now that we've done our kind of brief overview, we're going to dive in a little more specific about each of these groups. We'll start with the Gaels of Ireland. This is a province the Romans called Hibernia. The Romans referred to the inhabitants of Ireland as the Scotai, though I use the term Gaels because it shows the connection between the ancient inhabitants of Ireland and their modern-day descendants, the people of Ireland and Scotland who speak Gaelic languages. Due to the absence of written sources on pre-Christian Gaelic society, most of what we know about this period is based on inferences from archaeology and later Christian sources. While the Gaels did not live in a directly administered Roman province, they interacted with Rome through raiding and trading. We've found Roman coins, lamps, glass, bricks in Iron Age sites in Ireland, suggesting that the Gaels sailed across the Irish Sea to trade and or raid with Roman settlements in Britain and France. The preponderance of Roman coins at the Irish site of Newgrange has led some scholars to suggest that the Gaels may have been hired as mercenaries by the Romans in their wars against the Picts. The Gaels also seem to have imported some of the Roman household gods to Ireland, as we have found some Roman idols there. Gaelic life centered around the roundhouse, which was a large wooden structure where tribal leaders would have convened with local elites. The Gaels at this time are notable for their construction of these large underground passage tombs. These are great earthen mounds where they would bury their dead. Newgrange, outside of Dublin, is the most famous example of these tombs. Gaelic religion, as far as we can tell, was similar to the religion practiced by the Gauls and the Britons before the Roman conquest of those areas. Druids led Gaelic religious practice at key sacred sites around Ireland, the most famous of which is the Hill of Tara, where later Irish high kings would be crowned. The Gaels probably worshipped Celtic gods like Lugus, and these gods would go on to become the basis of the Tuatha De Danann of medieval Irish legend. We'll definitely do a deep dive into these legends later on. The medieval Irish economy was based on cattle, and we can infer, based on the central role that cows played in Irish law and mythology, that cows were just central to Gaelic life. While we have found a large amount of Roman coins in Ireland, there is evidence that cows kind of acted as currency in Ireland. Trade would be conducted through exchanges of cattle, because coins aren't minted in Ireland until the 11th century. The other major component of Irish society that I want to talk about is slavery. Slavery is a major part of life in the ancient world, especially in the Roman Empire, of course. But the Gaels would also enslave members of other Gaelic tribes that they defeated in combat. They would force them to work as agricultural laborers, household laborers, craftsmen, or in some cases sex slaves. The Gaels also raided Roman Britain for slaves, which ironically contributed to the spread of Roman culture in Ireland. In fact, the most famous slave captured by the Irish in Britain was a boy by the name of Patricius, who we know now as Saint Patrick, as he returned to Ireland after he escaped slavery to spread Christianity there. The Picts to the north of Roman Britain shared a common cultural ancestry with the Celtic Britons living under Roman rule. There's a lot of debate about the extent to which the Picts were kind of ethnically separate from the Britons. Some historians believe that really the key difference between the Britons to the south of the wall and the Picts to the north of the wall, referring here to Emperor Hadrian's wall, of course, is just that the Picts were not exposed to that Roman cultural influence in the way that the Britons in the south were. So to be a Pict really just means that you were a Briton who lived north of Hadrian's Wall and thus lived outside the Roman cultural sphere. The Picts were ruled by local princes like the Gauls and Britons before the Roman conquests. They painted themselves blue in battle, and according to Roman sources, they wore kind of scant dress, and they bore these large torques around their necks. The Picts were particularly troublesome for the Romans, as numerous Roman military expeditions were required to prevent Pictish raids into northern Roman territory. The Emperor Constantine, who was acclaimed emperor in Britain, was in Britain because he was there with his father on a campaign against the Picts, who had been raiding into northern British territory. On the European mainland, there's also a large group of barbarians that we refer to as the Germans or the Germanic tribes. The term Germanic is an umbrella term. It's like the term Celtic. They both describe, kind of an ethnic supergroup from which, dozens, if not hundreds, of tribes descended from. We consider tribes Germanic if their language is believed to have descended from the Proto-Germanic language, which was spoken, somewhere along the river Elbe, circa 500 BC. The good news is that we have quite a bit of primary source material about these Germanic tribes. The bad news is that most of our sources for these tribes come to us from Roman writers, so we have to kind of look past their bias as we try to understand these Germanic people. The Roman author Tacitus wrote an ethnography of the Germanic tribes in his book Germania, which is an account of the time he spent among some of the Germans along the Roman frontiers. Tacitus is actually somewhat sympathetic towards the barbarian tribes. He's often critical of the Roman expansion into barbarian territory, and he seems to kind of conceived of the Germans as noble savages. This is, a term that modern authors have come up with to refer to the fascination that, people from, quote-unquote civilized groups have of less civilized people who live, supposedly a nobler way of life without civilization's corrupting influences. Tacitus wrote Germania in the 1st century AD, so obviously a lot changed between the end of the 1st century and the period that we're really looking at, which is the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. The biggest shift is in religion. When Tacitus was writing, the Germanic tribes were obviously pagan, but by the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed, many of the Germanic tribes on the empire's borders had converted to Christianity. Some of them adhered to the Roman form of Christianity, while others adhered to heretical forms of Christianity like Arianism, which we covered a little bit in the last episode. Germanic peoples further away from the Roman borders maintained their pagan faith, and they even spread their pagan gods to new lands as they conquered formerly Roman territory. I want to be clear that although we do group these tribes together as Germans, they were all very much separate political entities. They're very diverse, and their descendants would go on to form, rich, disparate cultural traditions. We have these Germanic tribes to thank for a lot of the ancestry of the modern-day French, German, Danish, Swedish, Spanish, English, and Norwegian languages. So you can see how these Germanic peoples, diverged to establish their own linguistic and cultural innovations. While some Germanic tribes, like the Franks and Visigoths, would come to hybridize their language and culture with the Roman language and customs, others would remain almost completely ignorant of Roman language, culture, and religion. Obviously, it's difficult to overstate the importance of these Germanic groups because these Germanic tribes are responsible for a lot of the Western Roman Empire's decline, as well as founding a lot of these medieval kingdoms that we'll go on to study more in detail later on in this podcast. But the descendants of Germanic tribesmen are responsible for the foundations of the kingdoms of England, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Phrygia, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Tacitus writes that the term German was adopted by these Germanic tribes in order to inspire fear in their enemies, as they combined the Germanic words for war and man to describe themselves as the war men. The Romans viewed these war men as these terrifying barbarian peoples who, if unchecked, could wreak havoc on the, civilized world. Before Christianity spread through some of these tribes, Germanic religion was uniformly polytheistic. We can't really say that the Germanic tribes worshipped the same gods, but there were some gods that had wide appeal across tribal groups. These gods are probably going to sound familiar to fans of Norse mythology or Marvel Comics, because the Norse, as a Germanic group, worshipped versions of these earlier Germanic deities. So the chief Germanic god is called Woden or Wotan or Odin. Well, we have quite a few stories about Odin from the 13th century Norse chronicles. We don't necessarily know if these stories were later inventions, or if they necessarily date back to the time period we're talking about here. I believe that the worship of Woden, Wotan, Odin dates back to at least the 1st century AD, as Tacitus notes in his Germania that the Germans worshipped a god he identified with Mercury, the Roman god of messages, thieves, trickery, because these are all things that would go on to be identified with Odin in later Anglo-Saxon and Norse mythologies. Tacitus notes that the Germans offered human sacrifices to this Mercury/Odin god. The god Thunor/Thor also appears to have been very popular, and while later Norse traditions identify Thor as a thunder god and the protector of humanity, we don't know how far back those traditions go. Tacitus identifies Thor with Hercules, but it seems that he mistaked Hercules with Thor because they were both attested by a blunt instrument. Hercules was represented by his club, while Thor was represented by his fiery axe or hammer of later legend. Tacitus notes that while the Germans offered human sacrifices to Woden/Wotan/Odin, the Germans offered animal sacrifices to Thunor/Thor, which perhaps shows that Thunor/Thor was believed to be less of a blood god like Odin and more of a friend of humanity in early Germanic tradition. Towards the end of the 4th century, many Germanic tribes convert to Christianity, although quite a few of them convert to the heretical branch of Christianity, Arianism. Arian priests who were rejected by the Roman courts in the cities of Rome, Ravenna, and Constantinople took their message to the barbarian tribes at the empire's fringes, and they had quite a bit of success as they converted several of these larger tribal groups to Arian Christianity. However, some tribes maintained their polytheistic faith, with the Germanic tribes of Scandinavia actively worshipping the Germanic pantheon well into the 11th century. Even as Christianity took hold among some of these Germanic tribes, many of them blended their old religious traditions with their new faith, and they recasted the gods Odin and Thor not as gods, but rather as heroic ancestors or ancient legendary kings. According to Tacitus, the Germans were governed by local kings who would sometimes come together to form a large coalition to take out a more powerful enemy. The best example of this is when a confederation of Germanic tribes came together to wipe out the Roman legions at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. We are going to cover the major Germanic tribal groups that caused the Roman world trouble towards the end of the 5th century with the decline of the Western Empire. We'll start with the Goths, who played perhaps the largest role in the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, when I use the term Goths, I'm referring to a group of tribes that used the same language, which historians call Gothic, and had similar cultural practices. The Goths appear to have been distinguished from other Germanic tribes because they tended towards autocratic systems of governance, and Gothic chiefs were also well known for hiring these large military retinues that they used to aid neighboring tribes and Roman provinces. We don't know where the Goths came from originally. Oral tradition suggests their culture may have originated in Scandinavia, but there's also archaeological evidence pointing to Poland as the point of origin for the Goths. Tacitus, again, who's writing in the 1st century, said that the Goths were living in modern-day Poland, but he didn't interact with the Goths directly, so everything he records about them is hearsay that he gets from other Germanic tribes. By the 3rd century, the Gothic tribes appear to have moved from Poland to the Danube frontiers, forcing the weaker Germanic tribes in the area to either scatter or seek refuge inside Roman territory. Gothic tribes led a multi-ethnic raiding party into the Roman province of Moesia, which is modern-day Serbia, in the mid-200s AD. Through the 3rd century, the Gothic chieftains made incursions into the Roman Balkans and would steal Roman treasure, which they would use to hire additional military retainers. But as the emperors Diocletian and Aurelian restored order to the troubled imperial frontiers, the Gothic tribes gave up their raiding ways and instead took tribute from the Romans in exchange for not raiding Roman territory. It's easier to just get paid not to attack the Romans than it is to risk your men and material invading Roman territory and facing the legions. This is also when we start to see a lot of Goths serving the Romans as mercenaries in military conflicts. Now, the period of relative calm between the Goths and the Romans was shattered by the migration of the Huns into Gothic-held territory. The Huns, who we'll get into a little bit later, pushed the Goths who refused to kind of submit to Hunnic overlordship into Roman territory. The Goths sought permission from the Romans to settle inside Roman lands, and the Romans, fearing Gothic attacks, tended to grant that permission. Thus, a large barbarian population was able to settle itself inside Roman borders. But unlike other Roman subject people, the Goths maintained their own tribal leadership inside Roman territory. Gothic leaders would bring their military retinues into the Roman command structure, but they maintained direct oversight over their troops. They didn't really integrate their troops inside the broader Roman structure, and this leads to a lot of destabilization of the Roman state later on. The failure of the Roman military to really integrate these Gothic soldiers into units that were led by more Romanized people would come to have disastrous effects, as when Gothic leaders rebelled against Roman authority, they would take their soldiers with them. And this led to a lot of rebellions inside Roman territory in the 5th century. Near the end of the 4th century, there's a talented Gothic military leader by the name of Alaric who is elected as King of the Goths, and he led an army of Goths and Roman deserters on a rampage through Roman territory. Now, some people say that destruction was Alaric's goal, but that's obviously not true. What he really wanted was the Roman Empire to grant his tribe a permanent home in one of the empire's provinces. Now, the emperor refused to agree to these demands, and so Alaric invaded Italy in a last-ditch attempt to force the emperor to give in. Alaric besieged the city of Rome 3 times over the course of 2 years. He ended his first 2 sieges only after the Romans made massive ransom payments of cloth, gold, and spices to his army. But Alaric's 3rd siege ended with the infamous sack of Rome in 410 AD, when his soldiers swept through the city, stole valuables, took slaves, and just generally abused the Roman people. After the sack of Rome, the Goths were led out of Italy into Gaul by Alaric's successor, Athaulf. This group of Goths, who we call the Visigoths, would settle briefly in southern France before they were displaced by another Germanic tribe, the Franks. Ultimately, the Visigoths were forced by the Franks into Spain, and they settled along Spain's eastern coast, where they founded the medieval kingdom of Toledo. The group of Goths that remained in the empire's eastern provinces we call the Ostrogoths, which just means the Eastern Goths. Unlike the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths maintained closer ties to the Roman court in Constantinople, and they continued to serve in the Roman military even as the Visigoths rebelled against Roman rule. These more Rome-friendly Goths settled in the Balkans and in Italy later on, and their leaders encouraged them to hold to Roman customs and obey Roman laws. There is one notable exception here with the Ostrogoth general Odoacer, who forced the last Roman emperor in the West into exile. We don't really know if Odoacer was a Goth, but some Roman sources claim that he was. We just know that he was a leader of a group of Gothic tribesmen serving in the Roman military, and he demanded that the Western Roman court in Ravenna give his army land to settle on. And when the Western Roman court refused, Ottokar deposed their emperor, took control of Italy for himself, and swore nominal allegiance to the Roman emperor of the East. Ottokar's reign is pretty short-lived because another Ostrogothic general by the name of Theodoric was on the rise in the empire's eastern provinces. Like Ottokar and Alaric before him, Theodoric led Gothic troops on a campaign of pillage in the empire's eastern provinces to force the Eastern Emperor to grant him land and prestige. The Roman Emperor of the East decided that he would give Theodoric what he wanted. So what he does is he offers Theodoric this title as supreme ruler of Italy, but what Theodoric has to do is he has to take his troops out of the empire's eastern provinces and defeat Ottokar. So the Eastern Roman Emperor is thinking he's going to kill two birds with one stone, get Theodoric out of the eastern provinces, and get rid of Ottokar. Theodoric agrees to the deal, and he brings his army into Italy, where he defeats and kills Ottokar, and so Theodoric becomes the master of Italy. And though he ruled as kind of an effective independent monarch, he was rewarded with imperial titles and prestige from the East for his capture of Italy. Theodoric's military and civic successes would go on to earn him the title of the Great. We call him Theodoric the Great now when we study him today. And he would become a central figure in Germanic legend to the point where he's even featured in the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. We're going to do a full episode on Theodoric at some point, so we'll come back to him later on. So with the Ostrogoths settled in Italy and the Visigoths settled in Spain, let's take a look at another group of Germanic tribes that we call the Vandals. We don't really know where the Vandals originated from, but we know that they were living in Central Europe alongside other Germanic tribes by the end of the 1st century AD. Tacitus notes that the Vandals were among the more powerful Germanic tribes, but he, again, didn't interact with them directly. The Vandals, like the Goths, were displaced by the invasion of the Huns, but they came into Roman territory a little later than the Goths did. The Vandals originally tried to push into Roman Gaul, but their efforts were frustrated by the presence of the other Germanic tribes, the Franks and the Burgundians, as well as an army of Romano-British troops that were trying to maintain order in the province. The Vandals therefore settled in Spain for a few decades before the Vandal king Gennesarec received an invitation from the Roman governor of North Africa to settle there in exchange for a military alliance. The Vandals, numbering somewhere between 15,000 and 80,000 people at this point, sailed to North Africa, and they met with the governor of North Africa, but when negotiations broke down, the Vandals laid siege to the Roman city of Hippo. This is when our friend St. Augustine re-enters the narrative because he's living in Hippo at the time when the Vandals lay siege. Augustine prayed for the city to be delivered from the Vandals because he feared that the Vandals would sack Hippo in the same way that the Goths had sacked Rome. And he was also afraid of the Vandals because they were Arian Christians. So they were heretics, and Augustine, being a Roman Christian, feared the spread of that heresy. Augustine's prayers, unfortunately, went unanswered, and 3 months into the Vandal siege, he died, possibly of starvation. The Vandals seized Hippo and the Roman city of Carthage, and they used these cities as the centers of their new North African kingdom. Gennesarec, who was then in possession of some of the Roman Empire's richest provinces, built a large fleet of pirate ships that raided the Mediterranean Sea for decades. The Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III tried to pacify the Vandals by forming a marriage alliance with them, but he was assassinated in a coup d'etat before the marriage could be carried out. Gennesarec viewed this assassination as an affront to his personal honor, so he got his pirate fleet together, sailed to Rome, and sacked the city. Rome had only just recovered from the earlier Gothic sack of the city, but when the Vandals swept through Rome, they were much more destructive than the Goths had been. They ravaged the city for 2 weeks, and they took thousands of Roman captives as slaves. Gennesaret, the Vandal king who had led his people out of Spain and into North Africa, became kind of a pirate king of the Mediterranean. And it was not until after he died that the Eastern Romans were able to challenge Vandal control of the Mediterranean Sea. The Vandals, like the Ostrogoths, adopted Roman customs and language. Artwork from the Vandal kingdom shows that the Vandal elites were wearing Roman clothes, and it appears that they adopted the Roman language, Latin, as well. The key difference between the Vandal and Roman religious traditions do seem to have distinguished the peoples. While the Vandals sought to emulate Roman power, their politics were still determined by these Germanic warrior cultural traditions, the importance of personal oaths, and this emphasis on valor and battle. The Vandals and the Goths take up a lot of room in this conversation about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and it makes sense because they were the two tribes that successfully sacked the Eternal City of Rome, which led to massive depopulation of the city and degradation for the city that had once essentially ruled the Mediterranean world. But while there is a temptation to look at these guys as the destroyers of the Roman world, we should resist this impulse because they made an active effort to adopt Roman customs and language, and their leaders often attacked Roman territory because they were trying to force the Roman courts in Ravenna and Constantinople to grant them legitimacy. Remember, Alaric attacked Rome because he was trying to force the emperors to recognize him as the legitimate ruler of a Roman province. Gennesaret sacked Rome because he was upset that he was snubbed in this marriage alliance. If these tribal leaders were only intent on destruction, as some Roman propagandists suggest, they wouldn't have tried so hard to be taken seriously by Roman leaders. Honestly, had the Romans made more of an effort to co-opt these powerful tribal leaders, they may have avoided the destabilization that these guys brought to Roman territory. But you've got to remember that the Romans did not view these men as being at their level. These guys were barbarians, so the Roman chauvinism made it impossible for them to view these tribal kings as their equals. And so they were unwilling to treat these guys with the respect that they felt they deserved. You can also see that the Romans were wary of them because they were practicing heretical forms of Christianity. So you can see why the Romans refused to compromise with these barbarian kings. More than anything else, it was the Roman unwillingness to negotiate and compromise with these barbarian leaders that led to barbarian rampages across Roman-held territory. Okay, now we're going to talk about two Germanic groups responsible for founding the medieval state of France, the Franks and the Burgundians. These tribes were Germanic, their language and customs were originally similar to other Germanic tribes, but these groups are kind of known for adopting Roman customs and language more so than even the Goths and the Visigoths. In fact, it progressed to such a point where the modern-day descendant of the Frankish language, which is modern-day French, is viewed as being descended from Latin rather than being related to other Germanic languages like German, Dutch, and English. The Franks and the Burgundians, unlike the Goths and Vandals, adopted the Roman form of Christianity. They never went through a heretic phase. Their kings never adopted Arianism, probably because these tribes lived further to the west than the Vandals and the Goths did when the Arian missionaries were proselyting the Germanic tribes along the empire's eastern borders. The Franks lived along the Rhine and were in direct contact with the Romans for centuries. There's evidence that Frankish soldiers fought as mercenaries in Julius Caesar's armies long before the life of Christ. Centuries of Frankish contact with the Romans led to Franks serving in prominent positions in the Roman military. When the Visigoths tried to push into Roman Gaul, it was the Franks who repelled them and forced them into Spain. With Roman power in the West all but irrelevant by the end of the 5th century, a Frankish king by the name of Clovis led his army of Franks and ex-Roman soldiers to conquer all the other Frankish tribes as well as the formerly Roman settlements in Gaul, and they forced these settlements to pay him allegiance. Clovis chose the Roman city of Parisium, which is modern-day Paris, as his capital, and he thus established the Kingdom of the Franks. Clovis laid the foundations of the modern-day French state, and he would be the first king of the brand new Merovingian dynasty, which would conquer the Burgundians who had settled in the modern-day Burgundy region of France and expel the Visigoths from their settlements in southern France. Now we're going to talk about the Germanic tribes that would go on to found the medieval kingdom of England. These are the tribes that we call the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These tribes, which lived in what is now northern Germany and southern Denmark, were talented seafarers. They traded with Roman ports in Gaul and Britannia throughout the first 4 centuries of the Christian era. But the wealth of these Roman cities held a dangerous allure for these tribes, and fleets of these tribes' ships would go on to raid coastal Roman provinces just as often as they trade with them. Unlike the other tribes that we've talked about thus far, the Angles, Saxon, and Jutes did not convert to Christianity until well after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. These guys were very much Germanic pagans, and some of what we know about Germanic polytheism comes from the legends that they recorded about their gods as they began to Christianize. Thunor, Woden, Tu, and Yngvi Freyr were key parts of the religion of these tribes. With the Roman military bogged down fighting Germanic tribes in Italy and the Balkans, this group of Germanic tribes had a free hand to raid the Roman province of Britannia in the 5th century. They appear to have coordinated with the Picts in modern-day Scotland and the Gaels in modern-day Ireland to launch devastating incursions against Roman Britain. And some of these Germanic pirates actually settled in conquered Roman forts on the eastern British coast. In the year 410 AD, the Romano-Britons wrote a letter to the Emperor of the West, Honorius, begging for Roman military aid against the Germanic invaders. Honorius wrote back saying that he was unable to provide aid because he was bogged down with Germanic invasions into Italy and Gaul. This refusal of aid to the Romano-Britons is usually taken to represent the end of Roman rule in Britain, as the Romano-British had to look to their own defense without the aid of the imperial legions. According to the Welsh historian Gildas, the Romano-British hired a group of Saxon mercenaries to defend them from the Picts and the Gaels, and they offered them land in eastern Britain in exchange for this military service. But relations between the Romano-British and the Saxons broke down, and the Saxons would go on to fight centuries of wars with the Romano-British, who at this point we can start describing as the Welsh, to seize control of this new land. While there is a strong narrative of Saxon conquest here, there's also a lot of evidence that Germanic peoples in Britain intermarried with the local Romano-British, though they maintained their Germanic language and customs. The Romano-British / Welsh, like the Romans in Italy and Constantinople, looked down on these barbarian invaders, and their failure to meaningfully negotiate with them was partially responsible for the conflicts that broke out between the Romano-British and the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Gildas is pretty apocalyptic in his writing, as he believed that the Christian God was using the pagan Angles, Saxon, and Jutes to punish the Romano-British for their sins. If you want to learn more about the relations between the Romano-British and these Germanic tribes, I highly recommend listening to the British History podcast to get a more detailed look. Despite a temporary Romano-British victory at the Battle of Baden Hill, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes became permanently settled in Britain. They would go on to form their own local kingdoms, which in the 9th and 10th centuries would unite in the face of yet another Germanic invasion, this time from the Vikings living in Scandinavia, and these tribes would unify to become the medieval Kingdom of England. Their Romano-British neighbors in the west would form the Welsh principalities, which would continue to be raided from the west by the Gaels in Ireland and from the east by the Anglo-Saxons, only to get further hammered by the Viking invasions in the 9th and 10th centuries. Early medieval period The early medieval history, not a great time to be Welsh. They were getting attacked from a lot of different directions. There are some other Germanic tribes that we just don't really have time to get into here, but we'll discuss these guys in later episodes. And they went on to settle in former Roman territories. People like the Danes, the Frisians, and the Lombards would go on to play major roles in the medieval kingdoms of Denmark, Phrygia, and Italy, respectively, but they aren't necessarily major players in this period of Roman decline. So instead, we're going to switch it up to talk about a barbarian tribe from far, far away in the east, whose arrival in the Roman world set off so many of the barbarian migrations we've talked about so far. It's time to get into the Huns. The Huns were a group of pastoralist tribes from the Central Asian steppe who spoke a Turkish language. The term Hun appears to have been derived from the name of the ancient Chinese state of Xiongnu, which the Huns may have believed to have been ruled by their ancestors. That the Huns appear as a key force in both Chinese history and in Roman history shows their capacity for traveling vast distances across the Eurasian steppe. The Xiongnu Huns were expelled from China by the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, but they went on to extract tribute from other tribes on the Eurasian steppe. Their empire spanned from Manchuria to central Russia, and the Xiongnu Huns would be key players in Chinese history well into the 5th century. Whether the European Huns literally descended from the Xiongnu Huns, or if they merely adopted the term Hun in order to create kind of a spiritual connection between themselves and the former conquerors of China, is not known. What is clear is that as the Xiongnu Huns were squeezed by Chinese forces to the south and other nomadic tribes to the north and east, some of their Huns and their tribal affiliates fled to the west. A group called the White Huns would seize Central Asia and become regular players in Indian and Iranian history. But we're going to focus on the European Huns for this episode. These guys are first recorded in Greco-Roman sources in 370 AD when they displaced the Alans, which was a tribe living in the region of modern-day Ukraine. The Huns secured the loyalty of several Turkish tribes either through diplomacy or conquest, and their capture of the Alans' homeland further bolstered their military ranks. Seeking wealth and power, the Huns forced the peoples at the western edge of the steppe to either pay them tribute and serve in their military, or to flee their lands. We've talked a lot about Germanic tribes in the area fleeing the Huns, but some people seem to have accepted Hunnic overlordship. The Huns weren't in pursuit of, destruction and terror. They were really in the business of statecraft. They wanted to force distant tribes to pay tribute to their warbands. They appointed governors and tax collectors to ensure the effective collection of taxes and the recruitment of military conscripts. Some Huns, like members of some of the other tribes that we've talked about here, appear to have worked as Roman mercenaries. Huns appear to have been employed in the Roman War with Alaric. The Huns were probably the greatest warriors in the Greco-Roman world. Unlike the Romans, who were known for their infantry, the Huns could field vast numbers of extremely talented horse archers, which were pretty hard to beat in ancient and medieval combat. The primary issue that groups like the Huns faced was disunity, as the hundreds of tribal groups under their command could assert their independence, and that led to internal squabbles that kept the Huns from expanding. But when an especially talented leader came along who was able to maintain good connections with tribal leaders and prevent internal squabbles, things could get really intense for people who bordered Hunnic territory. One such leader inherited the Hunnic Empire along with his brother in the middle of the 5th century. This guy is called Attila, and after he had his brother killed, he became the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire. This was a precarious position to be in, as the Huns appear to have preferred to have two kings so as to prevent either one from getting especially tyrannical. But Attila established his legitimacy as sole ruler through defeating the Roman armies in the east. His armies, which consisted of Hunnic horse archers as well as Alan and Gothic conscripts, were able to sack 70 cities in the Balkan provinces of the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Court paid Attila a massive tribute in order to secure a reprieve, in addition to a huge ransom they paid to secure the release of thousands of Roman citizens that the Huns had taken prisoner. Attila, who was essentially bribed to take a break from attacking the Eastern Empire, turned to the west. It appears he wished to secure a decisive victory against the Western Empire to prevent the barbarian tribes under his rule from defecting to the Western Romans. Attila and the Emperor of the West, Valentinian III, had a disagreement over the succession to the Frankish throne, and Attila, who viewed himself as the rightful overlord of the Franks, attacked the Roman province of Gaul in what historians believe to be an attempt to reassert his authority over the barbarian peoples at the empire's fringes. There is a story that the sister of the Western Emperor asked Attila for help to escape an arranged marriage, but there's debate among modern historians about whether we should really take this story seriously or not. So according to the versions of this story that were popular in medieval courts as kind of a classic courtly love romance, the emperor's sister sent a ring to Attila with a letter asking for his help to escape an arranged marriage. Attila, being somewhat gentlemanly in these tales, decided to save the emperor's sister by marrying her himself. Valentinian, who was distraught by his sister's actions, sent her into exile, and so Attila invaded the Western Empire in the hopes of forcing Valentinian to allow the marriage to proceed, and in hopes of seizing half the empire as the dowry for this marriage. This story is obviously a little far-fetched, which is why we view it with some skepticism today. Whether or not the events in the story are literally true, it nevertheless appears that Attila felt that his rule was somehow threatened by the Western Emperor. His armies invaded Italy and marched up to the Eternal City of Rome itself. Outside the city of Rome, the Pope approached Attila and begged him to spare the city. Attila, for whatever reason, agreed to the Pope's request. Scholars suggest he may have decided to withdraw from Rome because his supply lines were overstretched, or because Attila feared that the Christian God might strike him down if he attacked the capital of Christianity. Attila died after overindulging at a wedding feast, and his empire did not survive him. The tribes under Attila's control broke free of Hunnic overlordship, as Attila's sons contended with each other for their father's inheritance. Though the Hunnic Empire collapsed, its legacy was intact, for its existence pushed many Germanic tribes to permanently settle inside the empire's borders, laying the foundations for France and England. Many semi-nomadic tribes would claim to be the descendants of Attila's Huns, such as the Magyar tribes and the Bulgarian tribes. We don't know how legitimate these claims are, as the generations of infighting that followed Attila's death preclude the creation of any accurate genealogies. The next group of barbarians on our list are the Sassanid Persians. These guys, like I said before, run the closest thing to a Roman-style state, as their king of kings demanded tribute from hundreds of satrapies, which are basically provinces, and they used this tribute to fund large imperial armies. Like the Romans, the Sassanids had a monotheistic state religion. The ruling Persians were Zoroastrians, though other faiths such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Eastern forms of Christianity were tolerated. This is with the notable exception of a period in the mid-5th century when the Sasanians tried to force Zoroastrianism on the Christian people of Armenia, which resulted in an Armenian rebellion. To the Romans, the Sasanians are the baddest of the bad guys. The Sassanid Empire, like the Roman one, was a regional superpower, and their armies posed a constant threat to the wealthy Roman provinces at the eastern edge of the empire. The Sassanids fought with the Romans over control of Armenia, Syria, and Mesopotamia in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and the Sasanians defeated multiple Roman and Byzantine armies over several centuries. The Sasanian heavy cavalry, in particular, was very effective in combat against the Romans, and they were often supported by hired nomadic horse archers. The Sasanians were interested in peeling the provinces of Syria, Armenia, and Mesopotamia out of the Roman orbit, and they had a lot of success in their endeavors. There's a lot of Sasanian history that we could dive into, but I'm not going to do it here because they deserve their own episode, which we'll do at a later time. For the purposes of this episode, you just need to understand that the Roman Empire's eastern flank was buffeted by an imperial superpower whose armies were feared not only in Rome, but also in China and India. The Arabian Peninsula to the south of the Sassanid Empire was home to hundreds of Arab tribes. Groups of these tribes were sometimes ruled by powerful kings like the Japhnids, Nasrids, and Husrids. These Arab kingdoms were political players in the Roman-Sassanid rivalry, and they provided mercenaries to both sides of this conflict. The Japhnids, who ruled the part of the Arab peninsula that bordered the Roman Empire, were Roman clients, while the Nasrids, who ruled the eastern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, were vassals of the Sassanids. The Japhnids and Nasrids were therefore locked in a proxy struggle between the Sassanians and the Romans. The Japhnids were useful to the Romans because their state provided a buffer zone that protected Roman provinces from Bedouin raiders. The Bedouins, who were less settled than the Japhnids and Husrids, were semi-nomadic Arab tribes that alternately traded and raided along the trade routes between the Roman world and the Indian Ocean. The Romans were huge fans of Indian goods, and so they shipped gold and spices through the Arab Gulf and across the Arabian Peninsula. The Romans actively pursued missionary work among the Arab peoples because Christian Arab tribes tended to ally themselves with the Romans against the Sassanids. The Japhnid kings were Christian, for example. The Arabian Peninsula was kind of a hodgepodge of religions, as there were groups of Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, and Arab polytheists present. Unfortunately, we don't know much about Arab polytheistic religion, as many of the polytheistic temples were destroyed by the Muslim Arabs after Muhammad founded Islam in the 7th century. While the Arabs weren't a huge problem for the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, they would go on to become the biggest threat to the Eastern Roman Empire in the 7th and 8th centuries due to the founding of Islam. We'll talk more about this in a later episode, but the foundation of Islam united the Arabs under a common religion and a common state, which allowed them to threaten and ultimately conquer the Eastern Roman provinces of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Eventually, Turkish practitioners of Islam would conquer Constantinople itself, which finally brought the Roman Empire to an end in 1453. Let's move west from Arabia to Sudan and Ethiopia, the area just to the south of Roman Egypt. Roman Egypt had been bordered by the kingdom of Kush, but in the middle of the 4th century AD, it was conquered by the kingdom of Aksum. Aksum, which was based in modern-day Ethiopia, was an economic superpower because of its key position along the Roman-Indian trade routes. In the middle of the 4th century, the Aksumites converted to Christianity in order to foster closer relations with the Roman state. The Aksumites are one of the few non-Roman peoples featured in this episode that actually had really good relations with the Romans. Their early adoption of Christianity, as well as the way that they profited off of Roman trade, made them natural allies to the Eastern Roman state. The Aksumites adopted aspects of Greek culture, and we have royal inscriptions in Greek from this period in Ethiopia. These guys also built huge monuments, tombs, and churches, and some of the oldest and most beautiful Christian churches in the world today exist in Ethiopia thanks to the Aksumites. The Aksumites were also key players in Arabian politics as they controlled ports along the western Arab coast. Aksumite missionaries were important in the Christianization of Arabia, and in the 6th century, they actually invaded Arabia in an effort to protect native Christians. The prophet Mani, who founded the Manichaean religion, considered the Axumites one of the 4 superpowers of the ancient Afro-Eurasian world, alongside the Romans, Persians, and Chinese. There's a lot to talk about with the kingdom of Aksum and medieval Ethiopia, so we're going to come back to these guys in a later episode. The last group of barbarians that we're going to talk about today are the North African Berbers. These guys lived in North Africa, both inside and outside of the Roman province of Mauritania. Calling the Berbers barbarian is a little bit of a misnomer, as they kind of inhabited a gray area between being fully Roman and fully barbarian. The Berbers had contact with the Romano-Greek cultural world for centuries, as Greek colonists set up cities like Carthage on the North African coast long before the heyday of the Roman Empire. Berber tribes living along the coast were therefore pretty Hellenized, and they paid tribute first to Greek city-states and then later on to the Romans. They also intermarried with Greek and Roman elites, blended their languages with Greek and Latin, and hybridized their native religion with Greco-Roman paganism. The Berbers along the coast converted to Christianity by the 5th century, but some tribes further into the African interior still worship the hybrid Greco-Roman Berber gods. The Berbers would fall outside the Roman orbit with the Vandal invasion of North Africa, as they'd go on to pay tribute to their new Vandal overlords instead of the Romans. With the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian's reconquest of North Africa in the 6th century, the Berbers would briefly re-enter the Roman world, only to fall outside of it with the Islamic conquest of North Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries. With North Africa falling under the control of the Islamic Caliphate, the Berbers adopted the Islamic faith and blended their culture with their new Arab overlords. Okay, that wraps up our brief tour of the barbarian people on the Roman Empire's borders. While we weren't able to go into too much detail about any one of these groups, I hope this episode gives you a broad overview of the situation that led to imperial decline and the start of the medieval era. The Romans were experiencing a lot of pressure from a lot of different directions as migrating barbarian groups settled inside Roman territory and undermined Roman rule from the inside. I also hope this episode clears up the misconception that these barbarian peoples were uncivilized or somehow inferior to the Romans. The Romans, in their writing, are kind of arrogant pricks, and they tend to measure the civilizational prowess of their neighbors based on how close they are to the Romans in cultural practices. Obviously, we should try to take that bias into account when studying Roman accounts of barbarian peoples. After all, if the barbarians were really so primitive, they wouldn't have been able to threaten and ultimately destroy the powerful Roman state. These peoples, after completing their migrations into the Roman Empire, would adapt key aspects of Roman culture to their own cultures and lay the foundations of the medieval kingdoms we'll talk about throughout the podcast. Other groups, like the Arabs, would transform from allies of the Romans into their ultimate enemies, who would shake the Eastern Roman Empire to its core. Okay, that's it for this episode. I know we went over a lot of information, and it is possible that I got something wrong. So if you notice an issue with something I said, I encourage you to reach out to me on Instagram or TikTok at 6th Age Pod to let me know. Alternatively, you can DM me on Instagram or TikTok if you have any other thoughts you'd like to share about the podcast. And you can learn more about my sources for this episode at our website, which is the6thage.podbean.com. Anyways, we'll see you next time, where we'll be talking about the life of the guy I consider to be the spiritual godfather of this podcast and a lot of the medieval age in general. And that is St. Augustine of Hippo.